Hello everyone, I'm Dan Heldman from TTS, and I'll be the host for your webinar today titled Implementing an Effective Compliance Management System. Just a few things I want to point out for those of you attending live today. You should have seen a control panel on the right side of your screen when you first logged in. If that collapsed on you, you should see a vertical bar with an orange button and an arrow, and that'll toggle the control panel open and close for you. And right below that, there's a button that'll put the display in full screen mode. If you want to ask a question at any point of today's webinar, you can find the question box located in the control panel. Just go ahead and type your question in, hit submit, and those will come in to me. If you didn't have a chance to download the slides ahead of time, there's a handout section in the control panel, and you can download them from there. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Carl Pry. Carl is a certified regulatory compliance manager and certified risk professional who is a managing director for Treliant Risk Advisors in Washington, D.C. Through his working career, as well as through his experience as a banking attorney and officer, he has provided a variety of regulatory compliance and financial performance services to financial institutions and other clients throughout the country. He has written extensively regarding consumer and commercial compliance, tax, audit, and financial institution legal issues, and is a frequent contributor to and currently serves on the editorial advisory board for the ABA Bank Compliance magazine. So without further ado, here's Carl.
Thanks, Dan. Afternoon, everybody. Hope you're doing well. Appreciate you taking a little time out of your day to listen to a couple messages we're going to deliver here, and want to welcome all of the Perspectives attendees here. And you've heard me for a couple months brag that there are some enhancements and improvements to the Compliance Perspectives system coming up. So we're going to talk about that, but I want to make sure that we're very clear and tie this into some regulatory change management issues. And again, to your Perspectives attendees, you've heard me preach that CMS is always at the top of the regulators list. You see this repeatedly in a number of enforcement actions. It's written all over regulatory exam procedures. It's just something that in the 20 plus years that I've been doing this, that it's never been more important. Now, fortunately, we have some guidance out there from the regulators as far as what their expectations are for your CMS. So there's really two goals that we have in the hour that we're going to have here today. Number one, going to talk about what you need to have and where you can go find the regulatory expectations for an effective CMS so that you can guard against those issues that a lot of other institutions have had when facing MRAs or MRIAs, certainly the enforcement actions and consent decrees that have been all over the news for the last couple of years. And the other half, if you're not familiar with the Compliance Perspectives webinar series that we have done and talked about some of the updates to that, that's another purpose that we have here, to introduce a system in order to demonstrate and evidence compliance with a lot of the expectations around regulatory change management. So do not want to mislead anybody as far as what we're going to be talking about today. It's going to be about half and half. Now, also want to make clear to those of you on the Perspective side, if you're happy with what you have right now, nothing needs change. In other words, do not view this as a strong sales pitch or anything like that. Hopefully those of you who have listened to me for long enough know that I'm not that way, so to speak, but certainly all about solutions and ways to keep your institution in compliance. So with that being said, let's look at the first page here and to answer the question, why are we making changes to Perspectives? And the answer is, we've been doing this surprisingly we just counted up a little while ago, for 8 years. So that's almost 100 webinars that we've done on the Perspective side, and time flies when you're having fun, that's for sure. And I don't think I would have believed you if you said I would have been doing this for 8 years, but that's a good thing, and hopefully you find utility and good information out of this. But the original purpose of why we started doing Perspectives, and not only to make your job easier, to give you the important regulatory updates on a monthly basis, but because that's part of demonstrating that you have an effective CMS. And if you're not familiar with that acronym, you should be, because it's critically important from the regulator perspective. And like we say there on the first page, this is a regulatory expectation, and I would say of the strongest degree. Those of you who have heard me talk before know that I call this the credibility game. In other words, you need to demonstrate that you are credible in your compliance capabilities to identify and rate and deal with the compliance and legal risks that your institution faces here. And in order to do this, regulators come in and they apply a very strict set of standards that we're going to go over here for a little bit and talk about what you want to make sure you have in place. Now, throughout these pages, where you see I have things underlined, in other words, you see right in the middle of the page where it says you need to demonstrate regulatory change management capabilities, that is where what we're going to talk about on the second half of the webinar comes into play. In other words, you've heard me say at length, if you don't have it in writing, you didn't do it. And that is just, I call that the 11th commandment of examiners, and not in a derogatory way, but that's just the way these things work. You have to demonstrate that you actually are doing what you're saying. And what we are hearing from regulators, and for those of you who don't know me well, I manage the compliance and fair lending practice for a firm called Reliant Risk Advisors in Washington, D.C. And we have literally dozens of bank and non-bank clients. And I'm in a number of shops, both large and small banks and non-banks, credit unions included, and have seen all sorts of issues and talked with a number of regulators over the years. And I've had the good fortune of being able to ask them straight out, what's the most important thing institutions can do? And pretty much without fail, they say, make sure the CMS is in good shape, because that makes our job easier. And a big part of that is knowing and understanding the changes in any laws or regulations that are happening, as well as enforcement. And if you've been paying attention to compliance the last couple of years, the regulators are not too shy about regulating by enforcement. And that's a sea change in the attitude of compliance these days, and has really rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, but it's the reality that we all face. So you have to pay attention to enforcement as well as the traditional regulations and laws and statutes and so forth that are on the books. But then asking the next question, how do those changes impact your institution? And then what are you going to do about it, and how are you going to effect those changes? So project plans and remediation plans and all of the activities that every institution is carrying forth become critically important. So bottom line, literally bottom line on page 1, what's your game plan when there are changes? How are you going to handle that and move forward with those types of things? Now, looking at page 2, these phrases and bullet points come straight from regulatory guidance. And if you look around, I think pages 13, 14 of this presentation here, you see a number of links. And you should be able to open up that PDF document and hover your mouse over it and click right to them. They come from all of the regulators. So you see them from each of the prudentials, the OCC, the Fed, the FDIC, the NCUA. The CFPB is part of this as well. And we're going to talk about the Uniform Compliance Rating System here in a little while as well, to talk about what the latest and greatest is from these agencies. And you will see there, again, where they emphasize many of these points. Now, again, what I've underlined on this page relates to regulatory change management and why having proof that you're aware of what's happening and what you're going to do about it becomes so important, and relates to what we'll talk about on the second half of this webinar here. So the CMS, this guidance from the regulators, establishes how you establish those responsibilities, communicate. You don't need me to read these to you. But then you look at the bottom one there, update your materials, your tools, your systems, training is in there as well as necessary. And again, the question becomes, how can you prove or demonstrate to a regulator, to an examiner, when they are in your bank or even before the exam, that you are doing these things? And by the way, this is not exclusive to just consumer compliance exams. So you're thinking, well, you know, next time they come in and they're examining for TRID or something like that, or even fair lending, this is important. But what about BSA? And what about safety and soundness? The answer is this applies to everything. And in fact, recently there was additional guidance from the Justice Department about what constitutes an effective compliance management system. And the Treasury report refers to it as well. So literally it is all over the place, and these principles run throughout what their requirements are. And I say the word requirements, even though they're, principles, or you say recommendations. If there are perceived weaknesses in any of these areas, it then causes regulators to think, well, where else may this institution be weak, and where might we want to and choose to focus a little bit more time during a particular exam. Now, like I mentioned here, we'll talk about some of the basics and the areas that you want to concentrate on, and whether you use this as kind of a checkbox exercise or just think to yourself, could we demonstrate to our examiners that we have these areas covered? That's really the critical topic at hand here. So what we have on page 3 is the latest FFIEC guidance. And if you're not familiar with the UICCRS, and that's a mouthful here, stands for the Uniform Interagency Consumer Compliance Rating System. This is literally how your examiners will evaluate your CMS. Now, I have a little statement there. This is not new. So you say, well, geez, this first came out, and it was effective this past March 31st. Now, that's the updates to this. So this is not a new concept, but it's a reflection of the changing characteristics of compliance in general, the industry that we're in, and reflection of moving more towards an enforcement environment, the electronic aspects of banking, moving into different media, that type of thing. But I will point your attention to a quote that's on page 6. And by the way, you do have a link to this in the back, so you can get this document. It was issued by each of the prudential regulators as well, through maybe FILs from the FDIC or the consumer advisory letters from the Fed, for example. But you see that quote on page 6. And again, I don't need to read this to you, but one of the things your regulator will evaluate to look at the underlying language, the effectiveness of your change management processes. Do you respond timely and in a satisfactory manner to any changes, whether they come internally or externally? Of course, internal change, that means any changes to your products or services, customers. Those involved in BSA should recognize those terms for your BSA risk assessment. But what about external changes? We're talking about environmental, to be sure, but we're talking about the regulatory environment and the legal environment, including enforcement. What are the regulators concentrating on? What messages have they been sending through some of the latest enforcement actions and consent decrees, as well as changing laws and regulations that you see in the Federal Register and in the host of other areas that I'm sure many of you are monitoring, and of course the prospective subscribers hear about on a monthly basis for the last 8 years from me. Now, on page 4 is a screenshot that I kind of married some of part of the chart that the FFIEC published on the bottom of page 13 and the top of page 14. Now, remember, this is examiner guidance, so they will come in and use this as their playbook. So they will look at these areas and they will rate you 1 to 5, 1 being very good, 5 meaning prepare your resume and get on monster.com. So you want to be sure to end up as close to 1 or 2 as you possibly can. So in the area of regulatory change management, you can read those quotes and you can download and read that for yourself. But this is the subjective determination as far as what those regulators want you to do as far as regulatory change management. So you read number 1, you anticipate and respond promptly to changes in applicable laws and regulations. How do you do that? In other words, ask yourself, how can you prove to your examiner that you do so? Take, for example, TRID and HMDA, 2 of the largest regulatory changes we've seen in some time. Now, the next mortgage exam, the next fair lending or HMDA exam that you have, your examiner wants to see proof that you are aware of all those changes and you are promptly and satisfactorily incorporating those changes into your processes throughout the business. So we can talk about a line of defense argument here, but suffice it to say, if your response is, well, we read the Federal Register and a couple emails and, we communicated that change to the business and they're doing what they have to do, that's not good enough anymore. They want to see some actual interaction between the second line and the actual business plans that the first line is incorporating. So again, this is the playbook of what examiners are utilizing to rate your CMS. Now, of course, there are many other aspects, but we're concentrating on the change management aspect. And I can tell you from talking with a lot of bankers and working with a lot of institutions, large and small, that this indeed is an area that is cited somewhat frequently by regulators as being deficient for a lot of institutions out there. Now, moving on to page 5, what does it mean to have an effective CMS? Now, you have that effective compliance management system with 4 interdependent control components, and you should be aware of this. In other words, it's probably not new to you. We've talked about board and management oversight frequently in the Perspectives webinars, the compliance program. So in other words, what you think of CMS, that strictly exists in the second line, right? And the answer is no. It exists throughout your institution, from the board, your compliance program, which traditionally is second line and maybe first line for the compliance professionals within the business, and then complaints and audit. So of course it does incorporate the third line as well. We're going to concentrate on that second element, of course, the compliance program, near and dear to my heart, and I'm sure many of yours that operate in the second line here. So what does it mean to have an effective and comprehensive compliance program as part of that overall comprehensive CMS? Number 1, policies and procedures. We all know that. We've all got numerous policies and procedures throughout the institution. Are those updated as the business and regulatory environment changes? Now, again, this is not my language. This is the regulators' language, plural. So how can you prove that your policies, procedures, processes, any job aids, anything and everything describing how you do business in compliance with a dynamic and changing regulatory environment? How do you document that? Of course, training, you could add updated training to that. And of course, monitoring. Some of you may be in the third line on the audit side of the game. Some of you may be in the compliance testing area or have those responsibilities. Of course, a big part of compliance testing is testing for new requirements coming from the regulators, or maybe from Congress, or maybe to reflect new enforcement changes and recommendations coming from those. And all that points to making sure that you are able to monitor those changes, reflect those in the operational requirements, policies and procedures, and then monitor those. And then, of course, corrective action if and when that might be needed. So what does it mean to have that strong compliance program? And you may have heard the term strong before, and that comes from, in particular, the way the Federal Reserve rates compliance programs, but that does go for all of the regulators as well. You want to be evaluated as strong, and that means you do have an effective and comprehensive CMS in general, but you can't have a strong CMS without the compliance program being strong within that. So what does that entail? And that's where this list comes from here on page 7. And again, this comes from the regulatory guidance. So this is not anything that I've made up, certainly not to be opportunistic, but again, we will present a way that you could comply with these requirements that will save you time, money, and energy. So, of course, having those current policies, procedures, making sure they're up to date, the monitoring practices, a restatement of what we talked about on the previous page, so a little bit more detail on what we had seen before. Now, of course, this has to be tailored to your institution, meaning this is not an off-the-shelf requirement. This is not something that you could call a vendor or a consultant, even a really good one like me, and of course, I'm tongue-in-cheek with that one. But it's got to be tailored to the needs and characteristics of your particular institution, whether you're large or small. Are you very complex? Do you offer complex products? Have a risky customer base, your risk appetite, your risk profile, all the things that we know very well in the compliance world, where everything must be tailored to the particular characteristics of your institution. It must be actionable. So in other words, it's not something that you just write down on a piece of paper and put on the shelf. It has to be part of the active program and has to be able to ensure compliance. And of course, being able to ensure compliance with the up-to-date and up to the minute, sometimes, regulatory requirements that we see. And of course, the last note there, it's meant to incent compliance. And that's really a nod to some of the problems that we've seen around sales practices and just risk assessments in general. In other words, are you able to identify issues? How do you then address them? And then the corrective action loop via internal audit. And of course, on the consumer compliance side, where that new compliance rating system focuses a lot of time and effort around consumer harm. And of course, the CFPB has a very strong voice in that. So you could add UDAP into that with a very strong influence on how your compliance program is going to be rated. Now, understand, looking at page 9, this is titled Board and Management Oversight, and that means being able to prove that your management and ultimately board of directors is responsible for what's going on here. And like I've said a number of times, if it's not in writing, it's very hard to demonstrate that you had done it. So that's really the requirement, that you be able to show something. Now, does that mean a piece of paper or board minutes or something you do in a system? The answer is all of the above. But it's of course, something that we in the compliance world know very well. So really, it's all about the evidence. And board and management commitment to oversight, that's something that can be demonstrated in meeting minutes, of the board of directors, as well as communications from executive management of the institution in the first place. But then, does the compliance department, as part of the overall CMS, have the resources that are necessary to do their jobs? In other words, are there the right people there? Are there the right number of people? Are they adequately educated and experienced to do the job? Do they have the capital, the resources? And that means the money sometimes. And believe me, I've been doing this long enough to have fought a number of battles with budgetary constraints around compliance, but then systems as well. Do you have the proper automation? And as we evolve as an industry, systems and automation and ways to demonstrate compliance in an automated fashion become much more critical, simply because they can do the jobs of many people. They can do them much more efficiently, and they can do them a lot more cheaply. Of course, your staff has to be knowledgeable. And again, with the change management aspect, knowledgeable means they have to know what the current state of the laws and the regulations are. Then, of course, third-party management is critically important. And I could go off for a good hour just on third-party management. I'll dispense with that. But those of you in the compliance world know how critically important that is. So in the end, at the bottom of page 9, it must be a demonstrable program in order to monitor change management, including action plans. In other words, it's not enough to just be aware that HMDA is changing in a big way. And yeah, I know there's some things I've got to do next January 1st. I think there's some new data items. But what are you doing about it? In other words, how are you able to demonstrate you understand what the changes are, and then how you're going to make it happen within your institution, all the different areas and departments and systems and individuals that are going to be impacted by those changes. Critically important that you be able to document that. Of course, I should mention that you're not just doing this because the regulators require you to, right? I mean, this is just how business is operating. And you know, we've all been around for major regulatory changes. Remember when all the Dodd-Frank changes came in, whether it be TRID or ATR and QM, and there were probably very large project teams put together in a number of institutions, certainly every mortgage lender out there. And he had to track how all this stuff is going to happen and how it's going to happen by October 3rd of 2015. I mean, there is a lot to do, and you have to track that. And that's the type of information that examiners want to see. Remember, on the TRID side, examiners were all about demonstrating a good faith effort to comply. How did you demonstrate that? Well, you showed them your action plan. You showed them the communications. You showed them all the work that you were doing to A, demonstrate that you understood the change, and B, what you were doing to make it happen. So when you look at change management on page 10, you want to systematize that. And I know that's my 10-cent word of the day, but in other words, you want to organize it, and it's got to be logical. And that includes laws and regs and market conditions and products and services. So a nod back to those external changes that we talked about previously, and then internally from your products and services. But you want to demonstrate that you're on top of all the changes that are happening around you and internally within your institution. But then once the changes have been implemented, how do you know that what you wanted to put in place is actually in place and operating appropriately? Now, those of you that are involved in risk assessments, this should ring true to you. So you've incorporated a number of controls. You want to make sure they're designed properly and are operating effectively. And then you're going to monitor the controls. And then you are just assuring that those changes have, in fact, taken place in the manner in which you intended. So how do you show that adaptation, implementation? And that last note there, it's not enough to merely show loose monitoring. What does that mean? In other words, just narratives. And you explain to a regulator, well, yeah, we have the auditors taking a look at it, or I've got somebody doing some over-testing of some of the new closing disclosures, or whatever the case may be. That's not going to be enough. And you say, well, I haven't had regulators complain about that before. How this typically comes to light is when there is a problem and examiners say, well, show me your action plan to actually make this happen. And you don't really have anything to fall back on. And again, you don't have the credibility to back up that you have the change management processes in place to do what you said you're going to be doing. So how do you control those risks? And of course, compliance is a risk management function these days. It's all about your ability to recognize, control, and mitigate compliance risk and legal risk. So you have to continually identify those risks in everything you do: products, services, activities, sales practices, marketing, whatever the case may be. And in order to manage those risks, you've got to, number one, develop comprehensive self-assessments. That's the risk assessment process, along with some other things. And then again, change management and implementation where those are appropriate. And I would venture to guess that there are very few places in the bank where that is not appropriate, because there are very few places in banking that aren't very tightly regulated, if not monitored, by the federal agencies here. And of course, the key is to proactively do that. None of us wants to be reactive, although all of us in compliance sometimes feel that way, that we're merely putting out fires when they blow up. But in order to proactively identify what's coming down the road and game plan for it, that's really the holy grail. And that's what we all seek to do in order to get a handle around what's happening in order to plan for it in the future. Now, on page 12, what I've done is include a couple quotes here from those documents. And again, you could Google this quote and you're going to find right where it's from, but it's in a number of those that are linked as well. But this is really meant to be a response to those that say, well, so what? What if we don't do this? Or what if we don't have the appropriate compliance factors that we're talking about here? What's the risk? Well, here are some of the consequences there that may impact your rating. You may not receive that 1 or 2 rating, to which you say, so what? Well, how important is a rating like that? Well, remember, this ultimately impacts the rating that if you're a bank, you're going to get in the CAMELS rating. And if your CAMELS rating isn't good enough, it's going to put a halt on any merger or acquisition or growth plans. So it's a critical component in your bank's overall health check, if you will. And change management, of course, is a big part about that as well. And you see that bottom quote coming from that UICCRS as well. And that's just some of the many quotes that we drew from that. So where we are now is I promised you a number of links. And again, you can download the PDF, hover over any of those and link to those directly. And you see the first one is the FFIEC's compliance rating system. And then you see similar links from all the biggies, the prudential regulators, the OCC and the Fed and the FDIC. There's also, if you look at that last link on page 13, there is a link from a presentation that an FDIC team did for what they call their Directors College. And that's very instructive because it's in a more bullet point format and hammers home the points that they've been making, that I've been talking about here. Numerous links from the CFPB and straight from their exam manuals. So like I said, this is their playbook as far as what they will ask when they come into institutions to establish the credibility of your compliance program and larger CMS. Then it's also mentioned in some of the supervisory highlights publications. And I could point you to any number of enforcement actions, particularly by the CFPB. And don't kid yourself, the CFPB, I don't know if you call them the thought leader for all the other agencies, but it is quite amazing how much in lockstep these regulators move. So it's not as though the CFPB is doing something that the Prudentials aren't. So you've heard me say a number of times, if you listen to Perspectives, even if you're not a CFPB institution, you should always follow what they're doing and even follow what other regulators are doing, because oftentimes something may pop up from the CFPB or say the OCC first, that in time filters down to all the other agencies, say. And then you see a presentation that was done for the Independent Bankers Association of Texas that explains some of these concepts as well. So a pretty comprehensive listing of what you see out there, illustrating those important conditions to demonstrate that effective CMS and how those will impact how your examiner will ultimately rate your institution. So if we move on here, what we're going to do now is switch gears to a bit of how you might demonstrate that regulatory change management. Now, again, if you are a longtime Perspectives listener, you've heard me say for the last couple of months that we're going to up our game. That's what this is all about. And this is a way to tie some of those regulatory concepts that we've just talked about as far as the CMS into what we currently have for the Perspectives. Now, not to say that you have to have one with the other, but this is really where this sprang forth. So in other words, I've been doing this for a number of years and have seen the problems that banks large and small have had around CMS and regulatory change management. A little bit of an inside story from me. I worked at a very large bank here in Cleveland that shall remain nameless, but you could probably figure out who it is. And this institution spent multiples of six figures and had numerous staff members to just keep up with regulatory change management. And you heard me talk about automation and the move towards doing things in a more efficient, more effective, and ultimately cheaper way. And that's what I think this is really all about. So I hopefully this does not come off as a hard sales pitch, because this is not what it is. This is just showing you a way for something that is out there that demonstrates a very effective way to monitor regulatory change management. So what you're going to see, and I'm going to switch over and actually take you into a web-based portal and a web-based system that will provide you with a daily update of regulatory legal enforcement changes. Now, those of you that listen to Perspectives, we do this monthly, and you probably have emails, you probably read some messages every day, but there's not one place that I have seen until now, and in all fairness, I know the developer and have contributed to some of what's here. But, you know, show me one place where I can go and I can get everything. And this is what you will see here. And by the way, this is not a paid only service. So lest you think, is there information out there that anyone out there in the public can see? And the answer is yes. Now, there's much more behind the curtain, so to speak, if you choose to subscribe. But at the very least, go out and check out RegChange. So that is the name of the reg site, or the website, excuse me. So just regchange.com. At some point in time, go check it out and see what you think. Now, I'm going to talk about some things that exist above and beyond that to kind of help you with that regulatory change management burden within the CMS. And of course, we'll sit on top of and add to the Perspectives. But this is really an integrated platform to help you anticipate and then also act upon those changes. So it's not just informational only. It's a, as you will see, it's got a very powerful project management aspect to it before, including pre-populated project plans. So in other words, one of the biggest challenges I can tell you from experience is, well, you know, what do I do about this? I see this gigantic HMDA change. I don't even know where to start. I'm staring at the blank piece of paper. That's where something like this will be very helpful, where you will see templates that are specific to those changes that you could choose to use or not. And I'll show you an example of that here in just a little bit. Then, of course, Perspectives isn't going away. So unfortunately, you're not able to stop listening to me unless you really, really want to. But the idea here is this will add to what we're doing already within the Perspectives webinar. Now, just from the benefits of what something like this could provide, it's what I'm going to call an FTE multiplier, FTE full-time employee. But essentially, again, institutions that I've seen and worked for You have multiple people doing these types of things where you've got IT involved, you've got compliance, you've got project managers, you've got trainers, and wouldn't it be nice if you could automate as much of this as possible and produce the documentation and the reports to be able to do this as well? And the answer is yes. So very, technological or industry term here, super efficient. That's my word, so you're welcome there. But it's a very comprehensive and systematized approach to do this, where you can assign ownership and tasks to people within your institution to be able to handle these regulatory changes, and then distribute those as well. So in other words, you're not the only person who needs to know this information in your institution. It's got to be sent out to those who have a role or a stake in that change. Now, of course, there are a lot of other aspects to this as well. You say, well, it'd sure be nice to have some reports that I could turn into my management or board or show the examiners. The answer is yes, there is that capability that will show you. For those of you that are CRCMs and have that designation from the ABA, if you are already listening to the Perspectives webinars, you might not have known this, so be sure to submit those webinars to the ABA. You get 15 CRCM credits. And by the way, that's for anybody who might listen, not just the person who is registered. So there is a cost savings. And full disclosure, I do a lot of work with the ABA, and I'm on the CRCM board up in Washington, D.C. So this is an approved topic for getting CRCM credit. Of course, there's the regulatory intelligence, and I say, well, don't miss out. And as you will see, there are many, many more federal agencies and regulators that you would probably ever care to monitor. And we just did a count, and I believe it's about 58 that are monitored here every single day. And of course, this, what we think, will combine an unmatched combination of resources. So with that being said, I'm going to jump right in here and actually show what this looks like to you. Now, I'm going to dispense with the public part of the website, but again, you can go into RegChange.com and you can find exactly what's available out there to the public. And lest you think, well, am I going to get those daily updates? Could I find that on the public website? The answer is yes, you can, but there's a lot more to it. And the CMS elements are really what we're going to talk about here. So what we're looking at here is assuming that you had subscribed to the site. So you'll see Bank of Pluto, that is our made up bank. You see my name at the upper right, so I am the subscriber here. And you see those tabs along the top where news, updates, project plans, and reports. We are in the news page. So this is the daily update. By the way, it is daily, and this is updated usually by 8 a.m. Eastern time. So by the time you get into work at 9:30, that's when compliance people report. No, just kidding. Probably 7:30 or 8. All that information should be there ready for you. It is posted in reverse chronological order. So if you look at the first one there, that was issued on July 5th. So it goes backwards. So you can go down and find what has been issued that day. Now, if you look towards the top in that brown bar where you see just to the right of that search button, you see the square that says all. What this indicates is you're looking at an unfiltered list. So this is everything. You say, I want to know what has come out from all those 58 agencies that are out there and see what's going on. You can certainly do that. Now, on the other hand, you're going to say, I'm a small community bank. I could not care less what the SEC and FINRA does. Is there a way to filter them out where I'm not cluttering up my screen with that information? The answer is yes. So when you subscribe and set up your bank's system, you can filter that information. You can filter it by the agency, so the various regulator or body that issues the report. You can filter it by activity. In other words, there are I don't want to say index terms or code words, but that's, some issuances cover AML, some cover mortgage, some cover securities, that type of thing. And you say, well, our bank doesn't do anything in securities. You can filter that out so you don't see it. You could also filter out by update type. In other words, there are a lot of updates that are Paperwork Reduction Act or comments requested on removing a semicolon, really minor, stupid stuff, to be honest with you. And you really don't want to waste your time with that. If you've ever monitored the Federal Register every day, you know what I'm talking about. Is there a way to filter out those minor issuances? And the answer is yes, there is. And that's, again, part of all filters. But you say, well, okay, I filtered some stuff out. Is there still a way that I can see the things that I didn't filter? And you can go and look at the unsubscribed, which will give you the information that you had previously indicated was not applicable to your institution, and you can see what else is going on. Now, you will see that on this, and the little arrows pointing at that little box, that does not have a checkbox or a blue check mark in it. And if you had gone back to the one that said subscribed, and you hit apply, those do have check marks. So those indicate that those meet the filters that you have set there. So there's still the capability to see everything here. Now, that's what the checkbox here says. Okay, so let's say you're looking at something that you've identified in that unsubscribed box that applies to you. So, you know what, this is something that I do need to follow. I previously thought it wasn't important or applicable, but I think it is. You can add the checkbox, and then it will show up in your list of updates because you have indicated that it is important to you. Now, if you go to the right of the date box, and you're looking at some of the highlighted ones. So let's go back there, make sure that's highlighted, apply that. You will see on the top right-hand portion, you will see a star. What does this mean? Well, the star is something that we have deemed to be, for lack of a better term, perspectives worthy. So in other words, when those of you who are subscribed to the Compliance Perspectives every month, this is going to be something that we will address in the Perspectives webinar. And those of you that have listened for some time know that I have sent out a list of links and critical topics. This is a way to indicate that this is something that will be discussed in the next Perspectives webinar, or had been previously. So in other words, rather than waiting until the end of the month or the 4-week period when we're going to talk about it, it's going to be listed right there. So that is going to be indicated by that gold star, so you can take a look at it earlier. Now, there's also an advanced search capability, and you see where the hand is, and if you click that, you can filter what you want to find. So take a look and say, well, you know, I know there was something that came out from the CFPB a couple months ago. Didn't they propose some changes to TRID, and that came out as an ANPR? And you know, some, but not all. Is there a way to do a more advanced search? That's what this is all about as well. So you can put some keywords that you know that, you know, mortgage was involved. You can put a date range in there to find out exactly what you're looking for, rather than try to scroll through it that way. Now, so if we bail out of that, you will see that every entry there includes the title, the issuer, the update type. There's a reference number, and then there's a little executive summary so you can find out what's going on there, as well as some keywords. And the link at the bottom there, of course, when you hover over it, you could link right to that. And of course, if you click it, you're going to go right to that link. So again, for your Perspectives folks, it's very similar to what we had done previously on the handouts, but it's going to be available sooner than waiting 4 weeks to be able to do that. So you say, well, that's all great online, but love my paper and I want to kill some trees. Is there a way that I can either print this out for myself or at least export it to a document? And the answer is yes. If you look in the far right-hand corner, the export button, you can export this to an Excel spreadsheet, or you could print it out. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the print functions as well as reports, which will be very useful both for regulators as well as your management and your board of directors ultimately. Okay, also worth noting, and I'll speak a little bit more later to those techies in the crowd here, as far as you're thinking, well, what about info security? What about privacy and that type of thing? You can make this new news page available to each subscriber and various people within your institution, and you can even connect it to an intranet that you have within your institution. Now, that is above my pay grade as far as technological capabilities, but for those of you that know what an API is, that's the system by which and the methodology by which it has done. And I'm here to tell you, and I have no vested interest in this particular platform, but it's the best one I've seen, and it's why I'm talking about it here. So this is not the FRI compliance service, mind you, but I've seen a lot of them out there, and a lot of them are really, really good, but none are as comprehensive and none are as customizable as what I've seen here. So let's move on to the next tab and let's look at some updates. And you say, well, that's great. I can look at some of this information here. So how does this actually work as far as doing something and dispositioning some of these updates? So this is the beginning here. This is how you would actually use this system to meet your RegChange management needs. So how would you plug this into your CMS? So this first page is a very rudimentary dashboard to give you a notification that say, well, there are 6 new items that are ready for you to review or disposition. This could be a daily task that someone in your institution does. And then you see the green circle, how many of those are in progress, and then how many of those are being monitored. So these are various stages in the process. And as you complete or populate the items, and just generally as you move through the implementation phase, they will pass from one to the other. All of this will present an audit trail for you as well to be able to track and demonstrate to whoever may need to know it there. Now, of course, you have the option at looking at all of those updates. You can look at the ones that you had previously closed. So let's take a look at one and click on the Ready for Review. Now, you'll see that we've got 6 of them there, 5 of them awaiting some sort of decision. So let's just click on one. And by the way, look at the very bottom one, that the FFIC, the UICCRS, I arbitrarily changed that date so it would show up in this so we could see how it would work. So let's look at the first one there, just called interest rate. So you click on that. Remember, that's a link. And you're going to go to this page right here. And again, this is something that is a subscriber service as part of the RegChange platform. And on the left is that summary. It's got all the things you need to know. So it's another way of being presented with that information similar to what we saw before, including the link. And of course, on the upper left, you could go back to the list, so the navigation is very easy here. You see the identifiers and who it applies to. And this is what we call the peg rate. So let's just assume, for the sake of example, this does apply to your bank. Now, this is a fairly simple one, so we've determined it applicable. I'm going to assign it. Now, of course, this list is going to be populated by you. So I'm just going to assign it to me. I'm also going to send it to the operations department because these are the folks that need to know about this. Now, you notice when I clicked that button that said send, a little green box showed up that sent an email to the designated individual. That's going to pop into their email box in the inbox and say, look, this just came across the wire. You need to do something with it. We'll talk about that something here in a little bit. Then you will record the actions that I'm going to take since I assigned it to myself. And that can be a number of these things you see listed in the dropdown. And by the way, this is I don't want to say open system, but anybody who is interested in this, wants more information, we are very interested in feedback. And you say, well, could it do this or could it do that? Please provide that feedback because this is all about making your institution more efficient in what you do. Now, I also want to give someone else access to this, and I'm going to give Mary Kelly action for that. But I'm going to, and you'll see, I'm going to put the action that I have, and then I'm going to give access to my good friend Mary Kelly. And then if I had some attachments, I could do that. For example, I could tell Mary to attend the seminar on the peg rate. Click that, we're good to go. Now, once we do that, and we would apply all that information, you see that little green box on the top shows up as closed. And if you want to go back to the dashboard, you will see once you click that, that one's taken off the list. So you have properly dispositioned that one. Now, let's say that you wanted to open up a project plan, and I've talked a lot about that. And you say, well, what do we mean by a project plan? Some of you have worked with something called Microsoft Project. So let's go back into that UICCRS. So how would you demonstrate compliance with the new compliance rating system? So we've deemed it to be something that's applicable and it's being moved to in progress. I'm assigning it to myself there. And we populate the other ones there as well. And then you'll see, let's finish plugging that information in there. And maybe the information is whatever the case may be. And I'm going to assign that also to my good friends, Steve Mnuchin and Jamie Dimon, because they, of course, work for me. Just ask me. And they're going to have responsibilities. Yeah, that's, of course, a joke. And hey, guess what? See what just popped up in the right-hand side of the screen? I got an email from the RegChange system. It is truly that fast. So once we do that, and you see the mouse hovered up on the upper right where it says project plan, and you saw in process in green. And I apologize for going through this at the speed of light, but certainly available if you want a little more in-depth explanation of what's going on. So there is the project plan aspect. And there is a template available that you see. And so let's say, yeah, I want to see what that template looks like. I haven't really developed my plan for it. So you click on that and boom. These are the pre-populated templates that we have. Now, these will be developed for those critical updates that would actually generate a to-do on your Pang. So an implementation plan. And again, if you're familiar with Microsoft Project, this will look somewhat familiar. Same type of capabilities that we have. Now, just because it's a template doesn't mean that you have to use this exactly. Is it changeable? The answer is yes. Now, there's a button up towards the right that says use this project plan. So I say, yeah, at least I want to use this as a basis, something to start with. There are some things I like, but some things I don't like. So once you click on that, then it's going to be the project plan that is going to be stored for your institution. And you say, well, stored on what? Stored where? Well, it's going to be stored on segregated space, and certainly I could dig into the technology for you. But in other words, it's not commingled with any other institution's information, so you don't have to worry about privacy and infosec and that type of thing. But you'll see a lot of the capabilities that are offered within that. And I can tell you this is priceless from having to manage a number of these myself. And there is a capability to add items, to delete items, to assign those to various personnel, and put notes in there and track progress that way. And I tell you, I could go on for probably half an hour on that. We just don't have the time to do that. But you can see the power of what this allows you to do, fully customizable as well. And that means customizable by you or your project manager or your compliance staff, rather than rely on what somebody is giving you as a cookie cutter here. Now, already there's been a request from a particular bank to say, well, hey, this is great, but what if we want to put our own update in there? Is a way to do that. Now, of course, RegChange covers federal changes, but what if there's a state law change? And you didn't hear me say, but what if there's other projects that you want to plug into this type of project software? Could you enter your own? And the answer is yes. It works the exact same way as the rest of the system. So it is project management software in and of itself, of course, aimed at the regulatory environment, but that's the benefit of having something to do here. So what if it requires some real work on the part of your institution? What if you actually have to do something? And that's where the real benefit of this system and where the compliance perspectives work together here. So if you go back to that interagency compliance rating system that we were just talking about here, and we changed the effective date, but let's say that it was going to be effective there, what are we going to do about it? So we go through those same determinations, and we've done that. Let's see here. Let me get to the right page. There we go. Well, and if you click there, you see to go back to the identifying update. We've already assigned it to me. We've distributed it, put a due date. Maybe I attend a seminar. We already assigned it to Jamie and Steve, that type of thing. We've gotten into the project plan, and that's where you can assign the tasks and manage it straight from this here. Now, you say, well, how soon will these project plans be uploaded into the system? And the answer is as soon as humanly possible. Now, I would tell you that obviously some are easier than others. If I told you, well, we'll have a TRID project plan updated within 5 minutes of the rule coming out, you'd laugh at me and you'd be right to do so. But I mean, the goal is within a week, because within a week, you have got to have some concrete idea of what you're going to do about that. And what about putting project plans in for regulations that are already out there, but they have a future compliance required date? And we are making that change as well. I should say we, the RegChange folks. Again, I'm not actively involved in that. I'm certainly not a web programmer. And there will be a software update where you will start to see those additional ones in a week and a half, 2 weeks, and longer as those are added to the portal here. So constant updating and making your job easier is the way to go here. So we talked about the customizability of the project plan as well. And again, you'll see those in various buckets where you can categorize those as new ones, or those in progress, or those that are complete, and those that are closed. And again, this is your audit trail. You can demonstrate to examiners, to your board, this is what we're doing. These are the hurdles. These are the roadblocks. And here, Mr. or Biz Examiner, is our good faith effort to comply with the TRID rules in the past and the HMDA rules back forth, or yet to come, I should say. All right. And again, it's very easy to select from the list what you need to game plan for and go forward from that. Okay. Now, some of you may be asking, well, what about access control? Is there a way to ensure that the right people are seeing the right information and it's not just open to everybody? And the answer is yes. Now, subscribers can be password protected. And for you InfoSec folks out there, multi-factor authentication can be provided as well. In other words, you can have the username and password, but also a system-generated code. And I remember, geez, about 5-10 years ago, you'd carry around a little token that would generate a new number every 30 seconds that you had to type in. That's now all on your iPhone or your cell phone, and you can do it that way as well to restrict access to those who needs to see it. Now, if you're curious, the system is housed in Amazon's Web Services, and their servers are separate, meaning your institution's data is password protected. It utilizes 256-bit encryption, so very safe and secure. And as a vendor myself, my day job for Treliant Risk Advisors, we are acutely aware of those requirements, and this meets those requirements as well. So you're saying, okay, and well, let's go to the reports tab just for a little bit here, and let's show some of that. And there will be information to come. I'm going to cut this pretty quick, simply, or short, simply because of the time. But you see some of the reports available there, where you can print out or save, and of course customize to your heart's satisfaction later on. Committee reports that you may submit to the board, or the project plan listings. The idea here is to make this as efficient and as useful as you can in order to demonstrate your adherence to regulatory change management perspectives. Okay, so you're asking, all right, this is a subscription-based service above and beyond what you see from the publicly available site. What's this going to cost me? And let's go to that page. Oh, okay. And I'm fishing around here on the site, so my apologies for that. But what I do want to say is, all of you who are prospective subscribers, you're going to get an email on Monday offering essentially the upgrade. And again, that's not something that you have to subscribe to. Perspectives is not going away. But if you're interested in something like this from a project management and the more detailed regulatory change management perspective, the RegChange folks, you see it right there, is $545 a month. And again, I look at that, and I've been in enough institutions and talked to enough regulators to at least my opinion. And again, I have no vested interest in this other than seeing something that will benefit a lot of you out there for what you have to do and just make your life easier. The $545 a month price is something I sure wish that I had when I was in the bank. But that's not my call to make. I'm merely the messenger to point your attention to what is available out there. Now, you see, it said that the pricing for banks less than $7 billion in assets. Where did that come from? Why did that number appear? Well, it's principally due to the fact that banks over $7 billion typically have FTEs and people dedicated to this function by themselves. In other words, they already have people that are doing this. And the smaller community banks are the ones that really need this type of service in order to perhaps take the place of an FTE. And I'm not talking about putting them out of a job, but make someone's life easier here. And by the way, for that at $545, you would, of course, get access to the webinar. So you would be a prospective subscriber. If you're not familiar with that, you would hear my voice every month going through a number of the critical regulatory topics and just give you one person's point of view as somebody who is plugged in with a number of institutions and regulators to talk about what is critically important over the past 4 or 5 weeks or so, and go from there. So let's dispense with me talking here. Dan, I'm not sure if there are any questions in the queue that you want to read out here, but I'm certainly happy to take any that have come in.
Yeah, we do have a couple questions here submitted. Let's go back here. What guidance can you provide to non-bank financial institutions with respect to scaling their CMS in respect to size and scope?
You know, that's a great question. And I'll answer that by telling you somewhat of a story. We are a risk management line, I should say. Where I lead the compliance practice is a risk management and compliance consulting firm. And over the last 2 years, the number of clients that we have that are fintech firms, mortgage companies, consumer finance companies has just mushroomed tremendously. And the reason for that is, number one, they see the writing on the wall. They see the debate over a fintech charter between the states and the OCC. They read the enforcement actions that the CFPB has been putting forth to mortgage companies and finance companies. And they're saying, we had better get on the bus before somebody comes to town and criticizes us for not having it. So if the question is, should we have a CMS? The answer is yes. Now, what should it look like? Now, I would use what I've been talking about in this webinar as your guidepost. So your framework as part of having an effective CMS. You want to make sure you have that oversight. You want to make sure you have that regulatory change management for those aspects that apply to you. Now, I know that's kind of a loose answer, and by the way, I'm always happy to talk to you over the phone or via email if you've got specific questions on it. But not to say you've got to have the same type of CMS that Chase or Bank of America would have, but to say we don't have anything is clearly not an answer anymore.
All right, next question here. Where can I find self-risk assessments for various areas, for example, new products?
Dan, did you say where would we find sample risk assessments?
Yeah, where can I find self-risk assessments for various self-risk? Yep.
Well, that's a tougher question to answer, and I'll tell you what. If I could write up a risk assessment template that would satisfy all the regulators for every institution out there, I would be in that business rather than the consulting business or working for a bank, because that would truly be the holy grail. Now, again, that's probably a longer discussion that I might have with whoever wrote that question individually, because there are a number of principles and universal truths, I guess, for lack of a better term, as far as risk assessment expectations that regulators have. So there currently aren't any samples, but there are ways to formulate your risk assessment in more of a uniform fashion that will satisfy regulatory expectation, put it that way.
Okay. And I think you touched on this a little bit, but could this tool also provide state law updates applicable to financial institutions?
I'm sorry, Dan, could you read that again? I didn't catch that.
Sure. Could this tool also provide state law updates applicable to financial institutions?
Well, the answer is yes and no. If you're saying, is this a tool where I could go and find out what has changed in the state of Ohio over the last 3 to 6 months, the answer is no, simply because it would take an army of several hundred people to do that. And I'll tell you another, I guess, frustration that is something that I wish were out there. I know several law firms do that type of work, but it's amazingly expensive, and you can imagine why that would be. But this system can be used when you identify a state law change as far as what you're going to do about it. So the project plan aspect, the communication aspect, and audit trail of what the system provides certainly can be used for that effort. Absolutely.
All right. Well, thanks for taking those questions. That'll do it for those. Just a couple quick reminders for folks before you sign off here today. We did record the session, and you all will receive an email later today from GoToWebinar letting you know that the recording is posted and a link to that recording. And then finally, as you leave here today, there'll be a quick survey that pops up. Feel free to leave us a few comments and let us know if you'd like further information on any of the topics discussed today. Any closing comments, Carl?
Yeah, other than my principal hope is this was beneficial information to you, both on the CMS aspect as well as the expectation for regulatory change management. And again, my purpose here was just to point out a pretty slick interface that I had not seen before. And believe me, I'm not in the business of promoting software, but this is something that I had not seen before, and it was a way to really up our game in the Compliance Perspectives webinar series. So that's why we're talking about it here today. So I appreciate you putting up with it.
All right. Well, that'll do it, folks. And thanks again, Carl. We'll talk next time.
Thanks very much.